Shoftim Vishotorim Titen lecha bekol sharecha asher YHWH Elohecha noten lecha lishvatecha v'shafetu et hayam mishpat tzedek. Judges and officers shall you make in all your gates, which YHWH your Elohim gives you, tribe by tribe, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment, or just judgment. Shalom, and welcome to another edition of our Daily Bread, where we discuss the Weekly Torah Portion. This week's Parashat is Parashat Shoftim, which is the 5th Parashat of the book of Devarim, also called Deuteronomy, and it's called Shoftim, which means judges. This week's Parashat, my message for 2011-12, is called Discerning Between Truth and Lies. And this week's Parashat, we have a lot of interesting things. I always love the start of this Parashat, where it talks that you shall make, it says, judges and officers shall you make you in all your gates, which YHWH your Elohim gives you. And they shall judge the people with just judgment. You know, this is, one of the things that we talk about a lot of times. We talk about just judgment, and if you listen to me very much, you know that, to me this is really one of the goals of the Torah. It's one of the things that we're striving for. It's what we, I believe, take into the next world, is our judgment. Everything else that everybody seems to be focused on and searching for and trying to attain seems really frivolous compared to that one thing, which is that thing of how to make the right choices. Like Moshe said, I set before you good and evil, life and death, choose life. It's really about, life and death is really about our choices. And what determines our choices, kind of our library and our counselor, is our judgment. It's our ability to have judgment. So this message is called Discerning Between Truth and Lies. And that's something that I think that is very important in these times right now that we're in, because it isn't just about being religious or not religious, as many people feel it is. Their big thing, and a lot of them, is just getting in. Is it enough to be a Jew, to be one of the chosen people? Is it enough to be a Christian, to say you believe in Jesus? Is it enough to be a Messianic and to say that you believe in the Torah and in the Messiah? All these things are about getting in. Are you one of the lost sheep of the tribes of Israel? All these things are about getting in. Very rarely do I hear people talking about who you become based on the Torah, who the Torah makes you like. I mean, our Mashiach is the son of the living Elohim, and who he is, it wouldn't matter if he had brown hair, black hair, blonde hair. Doesn't matter if he was tall or short or whatever. What makes him significant is his judgment, and his judgment was the Torah. His judgment was perfect. His judgment in making all of his choices was perfect. And that's the real big value point there. And people find all kinds of other value to be interested in, whether it's getting into heaven, or getting into the kingdom, or getting some blessings, or rewards from God, or a promised land, or glorious fruit. All these things are all things that people see as the tangible goals, and the reason why they're moving forward and following Elohim. But to me, a lot of those fall short, because it's really about righteous judgment. And it's about having just judgment, which is one of the great things about the judges, as we're going to see in this week's Parashat. So it starts off talking about judging the judges of the gates. And a lot of times it's interesting, because we can look and we can see, what are our gates? Well, our gates, a lot of it we can see right here in our head, some different gates. We see our ears, we see our eyes, right? This is a gate, like your eye opens and shuts. Your ears, even like the Pharisees, can be can shut their ears from hearing things, or they can open it up. These are things that let stuff in. Our mouth lets stuff in. It can close or it can open. Our nose lets in smells and breathes out. So the interesting thing is, for the majority of these senses, it's really about what they bring in. The ears, the eyes, the nose, and then the mouth is kind of a little more unique, because the mouth isn't just about what it lets in, but it's what goes out from you in your words. And I think that sometimes good observations are a great place to start. The first thing that we can see really is that we got 2 ears, 2 eyes, and 2 nostrils. Okay? All of those are in sets of 2, whereas our mouth is 1. And I think there's some significance to that. But when we talk about the gates, there's also, if you go along through the Torah, this concept of protecting your gates and having just judges. That goes for what you hear, to be able to hear the right things and make sure you heard them. To be able to see, we make judgment with our eyes. Our nose. Our nose is a little deeper one. That's an interesting thing. What we breathe in, what we smell. And even it talks about YHWH, how the offerings are a sweet savor, right? He smells that offering and finds it acceptable. And in the same way, our nose has a lot of different characteristics. Like your nose has a lot of receptors that can pick up things like bacteria and decay. That's why when you smell something, you can pull open a gallon of milk and you can smell if it's going bad or if it's good. So there's a lot of things. That's a judgment call that your nose is making. And the same way happens with our mouth as well, because we can eat something and know if it is expired or things like that. Now with the mouth, it's an interesting one, because what we see here is we see in these gates, we see this concept of, and we're going to get into it with the 2 witnesses, which we see in this week's Parashat. It talks about the 2 witnesses, the 2 or 3 witnesses. And it's interesting, by 1 witness, right, you don't know. You can be fooled by 1 witness. You see, they could be telling the truth and you have no verification, or they could be telling a lie and you have no verification other. And it gets in this week's Parashat about the false witness and what happens there. And I think that's interesting when we apply that to our natural model of the face. And we can see that we've got 2 eyes, which helps us with location and depth and all of this. So it's a little harder to fool. Same with our ears, same with our nose. But it's our mouth that is actually out of that whole scenario of the gates, which is the weak one, right? And this is where man gets into trouble a lot, right? We get into trouble, as we saw in the previous week's portion, about eating kosher. How many people are bringing in, right, and saying things that are lies? How many people are eating unclean foods? They're bringing in something that's not right, and they're putting out something that's not right. And so this is the one that gets us in trouble right here, is our mouth. Okay? The words, it says, every idle word shall come into judgment. And this is what happens, and it's interesting to me when you look at the patterns that people have a tough time giving up things to eat koshers the same way, because this leads to the belly, and it's that desire, it's that momentary pleasure of eating something. Some people, they don't want to give up certain foods, or they don't want to give up going out to eat, even though it's probably not biblically kosher for them to do so. But they feel, hey, I'm just going to go and I'm going to order the cheese pizza and I'll probably be okay. Not realizing how many multitude of ways their food's coming in contact with pork products and unclean things. But you see the desire of their mouth, the momentary pleasure, just like sin, it overrules them. And it's a physical thing. A lot of times it's a physical desire. So this 1 witness, a lot of times when we're talking about witnesses, when we see 1 witness, a lot of times that's a model of the earth. So when he calls heaven and earth to witness, the 1 witness is earth, and that's the earthly things. Like Mashiach says to Nicodemus, he says, if you don't understand the earthly things, how can I show you the spiritual things? The first witness is those earthly things. And so a lot of our problems is the desires of the flesh. It's like what Paul's talking about when he talks about the carnal versus the spiritual, the earthly versus the spirit. Well, this earthly thing that we have, right, this is a way that we express that earthly desire. It's a lot of what we eat. It's the model. That momentary pleasure is just like the momentary pleasure of all sins that are here on the earth, but they're not the lasting things, the spiritual things. So we see this interesting thing with the gates, and that we're supposed to guard these gates. And if you look at your mouth, it is the largest gate. This is the main gate that gets us into trouble, and this is the gate that most people don't guard very well. It talks about your lips, keeping your lips. That's that same word, guard, to guard your gates of your mouth. Now, when we look at this, we say it's also interesting that these gates right here bring stuff in for the most part, and that can be a big danger to us. The things that we bring in, the things we look upon. Do we look upon wickedness? Do we listen to lies? Right? Is our judgment like our nostrils? Is our judgment of what's good and bad? Spiritually, see, in the nose comes the breath. The breath in Hebrew is the same as ruach. It's the same as the spirit. The spirit of things, do we discern them? Do we breathe in and smell and know the difference? And have good judgment about spiritual matters? Maybe, maybe not. But for a lot of us, we get caught up in poor judgment with the physical things, let alone the spiritual things. And all these things can defile a person. And then what comes out, as Mashiach says, what comes out, right? What you speak, it comes out of your heart. It's the same desire that you're feeding. It's a lust of the heart that you're feeding when you decide to not eat kosher very strictly. Or it's the same thing that comes out of you that's wicked when you speak wickedness or perversity. So these are all things we have to learn how to guard. And this is a command in the Parashat Shoftim, that we will have just judges, right, in this gate, in these gates, and in these gates. And ultimately it comes from that source. We're guarding the inside of how we influence our heart, which is our spirit, because then our spirit it flows out of all of our gates, and that's an important thing. So it's interesting when we get into this week's Parashat about judging yourself versus judging others, because that's that same concept of what judgment do you put out versus what do you take in. And this is going to be a key foundation for this week's Parashat, and understanding that there's two judgments. Discerning between truth and lies. Most people look at that only as it pertains to other people. Well, I don't believe that guy. Oh, that guy's a false prophet. Oh, that guy's a liar. And very rarely do they do that in the mirror. Very rarely, right? They have outward judgment, but they don't have inward judgment. Okay? They're not guarding both sides of the gate. See, the gates in a city do two things. Number one, they control who comes in, but they also control who goes out. And there can be wickedness that can come into a city and wickedness that can go out of a city. And there's righteousness that can come into a city, and there's righteousness that can go out of a city. And so we have to understand, when we're guarding these gates, it's like the door, right, that stands in the open field. It's both sides of the door matter. And people don't think about this, but it's the same way with the kingdom. Everybody wants to get into the kingdom, but they don't understand that if you're wicked and you have wicked judgment, then you're trying to bring wickedness into the kingdom. And guess what's going to happen to you? Well, I think Yahuwah is going to cast you out, just as we see throughout all the Torah, that wickedness and the unclean, they get cast out. That's always the model. Those go away, right? And then the gates are also guarded to keep wickedness from coming into Israel. Okay? And then on the flip side, it says the Torah shall go out, shall flow out, right? Of Yerushalayim out into all the world. Okay? So that's righteousness flowing out. And then, of course, righteousness, which is modeled by Yahuwah, His spirit of holiness,
is what's supposed to come in. See, we're supposed to let that in and then let it flow out. And we're supposed to keep wickedness out and don't let wickedness go out from us. Or keep wickedness from coming in and from going out from us. So this all comes down, well, if everything is supposed to, if some things are supposed to be stopped from going in, and yet other things are supposed to be allowed to go in, and then the other direction, some things are supposed to be allowed to go out, and some things aren't supposed to go out, well, then that creates this interesting thing, that it seems like stuff is coming and going, but then how do I know which one? Well, that's where it comes back to judgment. See, just judgment is the one, the gatekeeper, who sits at the gate and determines, well, this is a good thing, so that should both be able to come in and go out. But that's a bad thing. That should neither be allowed to come in or to go out. You see, this is the pattern that we have to start understanding. That judgment is all about standards. So when we look at the sections of this parashat, what we see is, we see that there's no copying, right? The next point in this week's Torah portion is not to copy the ways the other people worship their gods, right? Don't put any grove by an altar of YHWH. See? It's about the standards, and the standards aren't something that you learn from somebody else, right? There's this duality through the whole parasha this week. Is it about learning or not learning? No. Actually, there's things that we're supposed to learn. YHWH's ways we're supposed to learn. Then what should we not learn? The lies and the ways of the other people, right? So that's again saying you have to filter. You have to look at each item and decide, is this from YHWH? Because if it is, and it's righteousness, I'm supposed to bring that in. And I'm supposed to send that out as well. But we have to be very careful that we don't bring in something wicked. That isn't the true thing. That was a different way. That was a lie. That was a way that previous people had done things, but it was wrong. So we're not to do that in our form of worship. And all the time I see people talking about, oh, you know, well, there's a big divide. Oh, should we keep the Jewish traditions? Or should we not keep them? There's some people who say, hey, throw everything out from the Jews. And there's other people, other Messianics who say, oh, we should be doing this. These are the oracles that were passed along, you know, for generations. And see, the thing is it isn't a package deal. It isn't an all or nothing. See, in my opinion, the right answer is that we should look and determine on each item, is this thing of the Torah? And if it is, and it's not violating the Torah, and this is a good thing, then we should be okay to say, okay, maybe this is something positive that we can learn and we can do. But on the other side, if this is something that seems to maybe violate a tradition that may violate the Torah, or maybe something that comes from some pagan culture, form of worship, that the Jews adopted, then we should reject it. You see? It isn't about just copying. See, when we try and copy, when we try and sit back and listen to the pastor, and the pastor's the right guy, and whatever he says, I'm going to copy him, instead of doing my own study. Well, copying is a problem, right? You're not supposed to copy somebody else. You're supposed to study for yourself, study the Torah. And the only thing you should copy, and seek to copy, is the ways of YHWH. And in that you have to have discernment, because you can be the liar. You can be the falsehood, the one that's lying to yourself because you misunderstand things. So you read something and tell yourself it's right, and then you believe yourself and follow yourself, and don't realize that you're not actually following the Torah, you're following what you think the Torah means. That's why the only way to know and discern between the truth and lies of others and the truth and lies that you put upon yourself, from both ignorance and from your own wickedness that wants to believe some things and not believe others. Other times it's just ignorance, where you're not understanding something because you haven't studied enough to put it in the context of the whole Torah and the whole Bible. So you're going to make more mistakes and have more misunderstandings when you haven't studied the whole Bible that much. Okay? So you'll deceive yourself more in the beginning, and it's easier for you to be deceived by others, because you have nothing to verify it against. The longer you're in the study, the more humble you are, the more you go every time to that parashat and say, I don't know anything about this parashat. Let me read it fresh with new eyes. Let me challenge everything I thought I knew and that I think I believe. When you're constantly challenging yourself, when you're that master, that watchman of your own gate, examining what's coming, right? The watchman sits on the wall and he looks at what's trying to come in. And the watchman also looks behind and sees what's trying to go out. And he's constantly judging and evaluating those things, and that's how we're supposed to be with ourselves. See, everyone applies that to everyone else. Hey, who are you trying to teach me this strange new thing? I bet you're an enemy. I'm going to cast you away. You must be a false prophet. Hey, everybody, no one should listen to this guy. I see that kind of stuff all the time. I don't see them, when they're studying, saying, wait a minute. What is this thing I'm about to believe? What is this thing? Yes, it looks like this is right. So automatically you let it in your gates? No, because you should realize that you'll deceive yourself and that you're ignorant. And that you'll allow lies in because of your ignorance. You'll allow the wolf in the sheep's clothing in. Because you'll read this verse and think it means this. And you'll allow that to be part of your truth. And you'll allow that to be something you build other things on. And you don't realize you've just brought poison to yourself. And that you're going to confuse yourself more now that you have your one misunderstanding, will also create more misunderstandings in the text. And here you are, the watchman, letting every lie into your gates. And once you let one lie in, you start to think the lie was the truth, so you let the other one that looks just like that in. Well, that's another lie. You don't realize that because you're not cautious. You're not humble. You're not ever testing yourself. You're not ever doubting yourself. You're not always humble and betting and giving yourself not the benefit of the doubt, but saying, I probably believe a ton of lies. I've told myself that they're true. You see, you should be a fearful watchman, worried that you constantly let the guy in, let the lie in. It's going to destroy the whole place and pollute the whole place. You see, that should be what you're worried about all the time. Because when we learn about the watchman, we learn that it's about blood guiltiness, right? If he sees the evil and doesn't warn the people, then that guilt of their death is upon him. That's blood guiltiness. So he let the person come in, didn't think it was evil, so he didn't even warn the people inside. Because he's only warning people about the things that he thinks are evil. He's only warning the people about the obvious enemies. But see, I see that in the Messianics, I see that in religion. Everybody has been fooled into thinking all we have to do is look out for the obvious enemies. We have to look out for the things that don't even sound right to us. Those are the obvious ones. A kid could solve that riddle. It's obvious. But see, the wiser watchman has to sit there and realize that it's not just the guy in the suit of armor who's got his sword drawn and says, I want to kill you, let me in. That's not the only enemy. Some of the worst enemies are the ones who say, good day to you, sir. And you say, well, they look nice. Let's let them in. The next thing you know, they're poisoning everybody inside. And you let them in because they seem so nice. You see, when you talk about the false Messiah, the Antichrist, the anti-Messiah, that word is really pseudo. It's a copy. It's not somebody who comes out and is like, let's kill Jesus, or down with the Messiah of Avraham. No. It's the one that's pretending to be the Messiah, right? Look at who killed Mashiach. Even at his own table, one of his own disciples turned against him, right? Who he shared the bread with. The bread is the word of Elohim. So the people who you share the word of Elohim with, right? The parable of the wheat and the tares, all that. The enemies are going to be the enemies of your own household. I mean, how many times does I have to say it before you get the fact that it's not about the obvious enemies? It's about the ones who should have received you, the ones who say they believe in the same God, the ones who say and pretend to be righteous, who are the wolves that are there to devour the flock. And it's not all obvious. Sometimes they don't realize they're devouring the flock because their ignorance and their lies, they're spreading them around, and they're spreading them as truth. You see, even if I say something, I will tell people this is what I understand, but I don't claim it to be the truth. And there's tons of people who run around saying, nope, I know this is true. and they start telling things. And the fact is, they may be devouring the flock and not knowing. Because their pride makes them think they have truth. Instead of them coming humbly and saying, look, this could be right or wrong. I don't know, I'm just a student. This is what I understand, but don't take it as gospel. Do your own study, right? Then they're not claiming to be the teacher, the rabbi, as it says, don't be called rabbi. And instead they're creating disciples. So it's okay to fellowship, right? Because we're going to get into that in this week's Parashat. We have the cities of refuge, accidental death, right? But there's a difference between an accident and doing something where the Torah teaches us that there's liability if you dug a pit and didn't cover it. You could say, oh, it was an accident, somebody fell in there, but it isn't. You're liable because you should have known better, because you could have done something, even if the person still could have fallen in the pit. You could have covered it up. They still could fall in the pit, but at least you wouldn't be guilty then, because you did your responsibility. It's just like building the fence on your rooftop. It doesn't mean someone can't still fall over the fence. But if you didn't build a fence and they fall over, that's a different blood guiltiness than if you built the fence and they still fell over. You see? And that's what we're talking about here. When we talk about the cities of refuge, the place where the person who accidentally murdered somebody can run to. Right? But it also tells us that the person who, it wasn't an accident and they killed somebody and they still tried to run to the city of refuge, the judges are going to take them and deliver them to the avenger of blood. They don't belong there. This is about discerning the truth and the lies, because both can look very similar. But there's a certain amount of due diligence that we're required to do. It's just as when we're bringing our offering, it says we'll offer nothing blemished. Right? So it's not just about saying, well, here's a lamb of the first year. That's what you asked for. No, we have our due diligence to observe that lamb and look over it and make sure it's not blemished. And some people will accidentally, because they don't have a trained eye, they'll attempt to offer something blemished up to YHWH, which is a sin. But see, that depends on how trained your eye is. And that's the same way when we're making our choices. If we're to be just judges of our gates, but we don't know the Word of God, then we'll be an unjust judge, not on purpose, but by accident. We'll be a watchman that allows evil in, not on purpose, but by ignorance. And an ignorant watchman, an ignorant person, still gets punished. You see? That is part of your liability, that you shouldn't be ignorant. You shouldn't have copied the pastor and just said, well, whatever he says, I'll let him do the study, and then I'll just start copying him and say, yeah, I believe what he says. No, go back and do your own studies. That way you can appreciate what that guy says. Because you'll have your own thoughts and your own studies on it. You see? This is where we're supposed to get. And so, nothing blemished and no copying. You see, because you're still liable. You're responsible. So, next we learn about the witnesses, right? Okay? You're supposed to examine the 2 or 3 witnesses. In particular, the witnesses, it says you shall have 2 or 3 witnesses for a man, a minimum of 2. Or a woman to be put to death. So what that says is, look at the mechanics of this. We're not just talking about for levying a fine or something like this. We're talking about a life and death judgment. When you get to big judgments, life and death judgments, then you better have 2 or more witnesses. That's the requirement. It means, number 1, that you're slow to put people to death. You're not going to put people to death, even if they may have sinned. And only 1 witness. You need to be sure. You see, does that mean that some people might have gotten off who actually did the crime? Yeah, well, they got off in the earthly sense. But YHWH is the other witness, right? He saw. He saw, and even if there was only 1 witness, he becomes the second witness. And actually, YHWH, right? His witness, as Mashiach says, if he were to bear witness of himself, his witness would still be true. Why? Because he represents the letter and the spirit. He represents the earthly and the spiritual, the heaven and the earth. He's Echad, because he's truth. So remember, you can't have truth without 2 or more witnesses. All truth is established by 2 or more witnesses. So when he says that he could bear witness of himself, it's because he actually, within himself, is 2 witnesses. See, he's the truth. We're not. Right? So physically, when we get in the physical world, each piece needs 2 witnesses in the physical realm. Okay, so that's how we establish someone to be put to death physically. See, we're not putting their spirit to death, we're putting their physical. And each one has 2 witnesses. And then those 2 witnesses, right, when he put the earth together, right, and he breathed into him the breath of life, remember creation, and what do you have? You have the living soul. That's what's created when you have the 2 witnesses there. Now, who can destroy your soul, right? It says, fear not him who can destroy your flesh. That's just one witness. Okay? But then God can judge your flesh and your spirit. And that is what makes up your soul. And he can judge and kill your soul. See? So what we got to understand is that in these matters we're talking about are a physical judgment, putting someone physically to death. So even for that one situation, you have to have 2 witnesses to that person. See, that person knows he's a 3rd witness, but guess what he is? He's a false witness, because he's not admitting, he's not confessing his sins in many cases. So we have this situation where we're slow to put people to death because we have to have enough witnesses. More witnesses means it's more sure, the thing. Now, this is important on multiple levels. Number one, because we also, within ourselves, all these patterns, they overlay each other, okay? So this gives us the patterns give us more witnesses. It helps us as you grow more, you should be able to see more patterns, because those patterns become more witnesses to your understanding. And that makes you more solid in your understanding, in knowing what truth is. So if people on the surface don't have much depth of knowledge, they only know on the surface why it says to do this, and they may do that. Just like the Pharisees, he said to them, none of you keeps the law. Well, that means that basically, certainly some of them were wearing tzitzis, and some of them were doing different things, but that was just one witness. They saw the literal, okay, I shall wear a tzitzit, but they weren't keeping the spirit of it, right? And since the Word of God is truth, and truth has 2 witnesses, then it means, just as we learned, that you have to keep the letter and the spirit in order to really have truth. And those guys were keeping just the letter of the law. They were just keeping the one expression, but not the spirit of it. Like he said, they were looking on a woman with lust, even though they weren't physically doing the act of adultery. But they were still guilty. They were still breaking the law. And they weren't keeping the law, because the law has 2 witnesses. Therefore, when they had 1 witness, they were actually, and he could see their spirit. He could see that they were breaking the law, even though outwardly they were trying to show that they were keeping the law. So this is this concept of needing at least 2 witnesses. This goes back to our Torah study. This carries over into our Torah study. Do we only read one little area and then say, okay, I believe that? Or do we study the whole Torah so that we can catch the other witnesses that also verify that this is true? Because I can show you this here, I can show you it in another spot, and another spot. Those are witnesses. And here I can show you other patterns where it doesn't directly say it, but here's the spiritual, the unseen. Here's the patterns that also bear witness to this. Because it's all going to be more and more witnesses so that you can know when someone is telling you a lie, including yourself. So all that, you're going to, in a way, you forsake your mercy. And your mercy from your ignorance, that can be compensated for with better Torah study. And then fellowship. But it really comes down to Torah study. The more you study, the more merciful you're being to yourself, because the less lies you're going to believe and accept. Right? The more diligent your observation. Just like the Watchman. The more he observes, oh, on the surface that guy looked okay, but notice the type of shoes he's wearing. Those aren't shoes from a Hebrew. Oh, notice the manner of speaking that he's doing. Notice the things that he's doing. See, the diligent observer, the diligent watchman, right? He observes things. On a separate note, I'll give a little shout out. I've been recently watching a series. There's a series from the BBC called Sherlock. And it's a remake, a modern version of Sherlock Holmes. A modern version. So, one of the interesting things about that is that Sherlock makes all these keen observations. And even though people think it's really about his deduction, right, his ability to put 2 and 2 together and say, well, then this is what happened, What they fail to see is at the core, at the foundation of deduction, is you have to have keen observation. If he didn't notice the scuff on the shoes, if he didn't notice that the guy's watch was a few days behind, if he didn't notice these little things, he couldn't then deduce what that means. And see, a lot of people do the same thing with their Torah study. They fail to observe enough of the Torah. So they make deductions or meanings, they put meanings to things that are isolated, that don't take into account these other 5 areas where it would disprove this theory, or where that theory wouldn't work very good because it breaks these patterns and it violates all these different things. But they don't think holistically in the whole Torah of that, because this goes back to this concept. So what's being put to death, right? The witnesses, you have to have 2 witnesses put something to death. That means that's so serious it's a life and death situation. Well, guess what? Your understandings of the Torah are a life and death situations, because he says, I set before you life and death, good and evil, choose life. What was he setting before him? The Torah. See, the Torah is the difference between life and death. And more importantly, choosing life. Well, if you don't know the Torah, how can you choose the right things in Torah? How can you choose the life that is in Torah? How can you choose the right choices if you read something and say, oh, well, this doesn't apply to me, or I think this just means that? So then you go out and sin because of your poor understanding of the Torah, which comes from your poor observations of all of the Torah, which would be the mercy that helps you not lie to yourself. You see, once you don't lie to yourself, once you get better at observing, once you're a better Torah student, you'll be a better fellowshipper, right? That's what I've always said. Because not only will you be able to discern where someone may be saying something that is probably not right, we can't say for sure one way or another, because we could be deceived in many of our own understandings. That's why I always say I won't know anything till Mashiach tells me I know something. You know, if he says, hey, you know this, you had that right, then I have it right. Till then I have to assume it could be wrong, but I have to live by what I understand. Say, well, this is what I understand, but it could be wrong. So when you're evaluating others, guess what? It's the same thing. This is exactly what Mashiach said when he said, take the beam out of your own eye so that you could see well to get the speck, even a small thing, out of someone else's. So he tells us that our witness to ourselves, everyone talks about, oh, they're the watchmen. You know, I've seen some people who were really vile on the internet in the way they treated other people, Messianics and other people, and say all kinds of evil against other people. When I'm sitting there listening to them over and over again, making common mistakes in the Scriptures. And yet they're out calling everybody else as a false prophet. They're the devil. They're the, you know, this horrible person's throwing all kinds of names at everyone. And you know what they call themselves? Well, I'm the watchman, right? I mean, a lot of people use that phrase. A lot of Messianics who have podcasts and shows and blogs and websites and all that. They always claim, well, I'm just being the watchman. See, they wear it like a big badge. Ooh, I'm the watchman. And they're only a watchman towards other people. You see, they think that they're throwing the spear down on that person to keep them out, but they don't ever throw the spear at themselves. So they don't realize that what they're protecting is a lie. Some of their theories are lies. And so they're keeping and criticizing everybody else. You know what? That's what happened with Mashiach. You see, Mashiach came, and all those Pharisees were self-justified, thinking they were doing God's work by putting him to death. He's a false prophet. He's speaking lies, you know. But they didn't realize the problem was that they were the ones that had the lies. And so when they were trying to kill Mashiach, and when they were coming after him and trying to criticize him, the fact is that they were deceived by themselves into thinking that they were actually doing God's work by trying to kill Mashiach. You see, that's the crazy part, and that's going to it happened then, and it'll happen again. Right? The people who killed Mashiach were the ones thinking they were justified by God. And I see it in the Messianic movement all the time, and in Christianity and Judaism. Everybody thinks they're holding the righteous sword and they're slaying other people with the sword, right? That says the Word of God is a sword. You see? But what's it say? Does it say it's just a sword? Or does it say it's a two-edged sword? See, it cuts both ways. So in the same measure it says you measure will be measured back to you. So in the same way you're chopping up that person, you're going to be chopped up with the Word of God. You see? And that's what happened with the Pharisees. They thought they were chopping up all the other people, and they thought they were chopping up Mashiach. And he turned it back on them and said, no, this is the truth. The difference was he had the truth. So he was the only righteous sword. All those other guys thought they knew the Torah. They thought they were wielding the Torah correctly. But they didn't learn that fundamental thing, which is, what if I'm wrong? You see, you can teach yourself, and that's called humility. If you assume that you might be wrong, then you're much more careful in how you approach the Word of God with more respect, and you're much more careful how you treat other people. Because, as it says, you could be getting visited by angels unawares. Right? You didn't know that you were actually talking to someone who had the truth, and you were the liar. And the sad thing is, if you ran them out of town and unfriended them and criticized them and felt good because after you unfriended them, you sat there on your wall talking all kinds of garbage about them, getting all your buddies to say, yeah, that guy was an idiot. Well, I see it all the time. It happens all the time. You have to guard yourself against those kind of things, because what you could have done is you could have just ran Mashiach out. And you could be calling him an idiot. And you could be saying in your lies, along with all of your other friends who believe the same lies as you. You see, you're in danger of that. If you don't think that could be you, if you don't think you could be the Judas sitting at the table, then you are in danger. You're in danger of your own delusion. You're blind like the Pharisees. See, better to sit there and be careful. Be careful like Kepha and say, at first he's like, oh, I wouldn't do that. But then ask him after he denied Mashiach. I can tell you, he probably was a lot more cautious in how he acted, because he realized that he didn't understand his own wickedness. He didn't understand the lies, right? He was the watchman of his own gate, but he was proud at first, saying, hey, I would never do that to you, right? Hey, I'm awesome watchman. If anyone comes out here, I would kill them and not let them in. But he didn't understand. He was the problem. He was the bad watchman that let wickedness in, that killed himself and killed others that he cared about. But if he thinks he's the best and doesn't realize his own weakness, then he's the dangerous one. He's the one that's going to ruin it for everybody. And he won't know it because he thinks he's the best defender. So you got to be humble in the way you approach the Word of God. So we get into this parashat. Next it talks about higher judgment, right, among Israel. It's essentially saying that the Leviim and the priests and the judges, right, when a matter is difficult, that they shall make the judgment, and people will listen to them. Now again, we get into the same thing, right? Do you see how pride is really the issue? The discernment of truth and lies really has to happen first inside. We have to put to death our own lies. We have to always be diligent in watching for them. More diligent even than how we watch in others. These are our gates, right? Don't assume what's inside is good, because what's in your heart, words that flow out of your mouth that speak, are many times wicked, and you think they're just. You see, you should be a fearful watchman, worried about what you've already let in, worried about what's coming out, and what's coming in from other people and from yourself. That's the fear of the watchman, who has that fear of blood guiltiness. Right? The blood is the life. It's the teaching. There's a teaching that's going to go on for everybody who's a watchman. We're watchmen over ourselves. If you're married, you're watchman over your wife and your kids. Everybody's trying to be the watchman over other men. Right? In a sense, they're trying to be a husband to other men. They're trying to be above them, where they can submit to their truth because it's greater, because they're the greater watchman. I see this all the time in congregations. That's why I don't sign the little agreement to be part of the congregation, because you know what? I'm not submitting myself to the ideas of another man. I'll submit myself to Mashiach. That's it. Till then, you should remain a spiritual virgin. Okay? You may not be a physical virgin. But when you submit your spiritual life to the thoughts and ideas of other men, instead of just doing your own study and working out your salvation and all those issues by study yourself, then you become subject, right, to somebody else. then you're someone who's already betrothed themselves to somebody else instead of Mashiach. And I think that's a danger. I think a lot of problems come out of that. So everybody assumes that they're the priests and the judges. They want these high roles, and they don't understand the fear and trembling that goes into being in one of these roles. Deciding life and death is a big issue. It's not something anybody who's had to do it, that I know of, over matters of the Torah would say, ooh, this is a great job. I'm going to run to it. I'm going to be proud and boastful that I get to decide who lives and dies. Because that's a fearful thing, just like the Watchman. Because if you made a wrong judgment, you put someone to death unjustly, then that blood guiltiness is upon you. So how many times do you want to make that judgment call and have to judge on those things? The more you do it, the more likely you've made the mistake. And that blood guiltiness is going to come back on you. So this goes into desire. See, it talks about the priests. It's a different type of people. If someone comes and they have all the desire in their heart to serve YHWH, then they're supposed to be allowed to go ahead. Even if it wasn't their turn to serve, let them serve. Now compare this to Israel. Now, when they go and serve YHWH, this is their life on the line. If they make a mistake, they can be burned up, just as we've had stories of that. So is this something where someone's just going in there and saying, yeah, let's do this? They're putting their life on the line every time they draw near to the holy things and the Holy One. Okay. So there's great respect there. And if they desire it, this is dangerous. But now how many people on the other side who are foolish, who lack judgment, want to be a priest? They want to be a king. They want to be all of these things. They want to have these difficult things that'll bring them guilty. They want to be the Watchman. They want to call themselves the Watchman. Well, that's a big role when you do it for others. We get that in this week's Parashat. What's the king have to do? The king has to write a copy of the Torah and read from it every day. He has a greater responsibility than the average person. Why? Because now his decisions aren't just going to affect him. They're going to affect others. A lot of others. You see, this is what this Parashat discusses, that all these people, it's one thing when you rule over yourself. Most people aren't even ruling over themselves. They're not a good watchman for themselves. They're full of lies that they think are fine, that are destroying their inside and going out and spreading that destruction other places. I don't know how many times I've heard people. They believe something a long time ago. Hey, do you ever have any beliefs you changed? Oh, yeah. You know what they did when they had those beliefs? They taught those lies to other people. And now later, years later, they come back and say, okay, now I know I was wrong. But they can't take that back from those people who taught. They might have taught one person who taught 4 people. And those 4 each taught one person. Now you're up to 8 people with lies. And over 2 years, you might have changed and spread that lie to 1,000 people. And that means that all those spread it to one more, you got to 2,000. The 2,000 spread, they go to 4,000. The 4 goes to 8. The 8 goes to 16,000. The 16,000 over, the longer that lie is spread, that you spread to that one person, the more destruction it's done. You see? So before you start going out, I might change my attitude and say, hey, a little disclaimer here. Here's what I believe today, but I could be wrong, and a year from now this could all be wrong. Make sure you do your own study, because that's just what I think. It's not a fact. Well, if you say that, then they spread it, guiltiness is upon them. You see, to the wise person, they're humble in their beliefs. Why? Because they understand that they get wiser and they learn new things, and they don't want that lie and that guiltiness to come back on them. But see, everybody wants to be the big teacher. They want to go out and tell everybody else all these things. But when they do that, they bring more judgment upon themselves, because there's the blood guiltiness, the teaching guiltiness, if they were wrong and if they were lying. Just like the Word of God is a sword. That means with great responsibility you hold that. And if you're around other people and you're swinging it around, you might kill somebody. And there's some people, they want to be the guy who's just showing how awesome he is with the sword around a whole bunch of people. The more the better. And they're hacking people up and they don't realize it. Because they're out there trying to share and spread and get a big following while they're spreading lies. Got to remain humble. This is what this parasha is about. It talks about the prophets. He's going to send a prophet like Moshe. Someone, right? like Moshe. What's that mean? Somebody who is like Moshe with the Torah, with regards to their discernment, their judgment, all of that. And how will you know who that is? If you don't know Moshe, you won't know Mashiach, just like he said. Because you don't believe Moshe, you don't believe me, because he wrote of me. See, but they don't know, just like he said in Nicodemus. How can I teach you spiritual things when you don't understand the earthly things? You see, Nicodemus probably would have thought he did understand the earthly things. But Mashiach said, no, you don't got it right. The prophets, we're supposed to observe them. We have the discernment to know whether they're right or wrong. How can you have that if you haven't studied the Torah? How can you compare them against your lies? See, if you believe lies, you'll believe the prophet who comes with the same lies you believe already, because you'll think that that's true. So the only formula that's logical that I can see that you can have is to constantly worry that it's what you believe is the problem, not what others. Not stacking up your beliefs so that you can say and criticize everyone else's beliefs. That's what most people do. It's the ancient landmark. See, we're not to move your landmark, your neighbor's landmark. You know what your neighbor's landmark is? Torah study. It's the fact that they can get in the Word of God themselves and study it to be true. But if you refuse to study, and they refuse to study, and then you try and talk each other into your own lies, you're moving, right? When you're teaching someone else something, you're moving their landmark. You know what their landmark should be? The Torah. And if you come in and teach them with what, even if you think you're right and you're wrong, and you don't tell them, hey, keep pointing them back, study your Torah. This is just what I think. It may not be true at all. If you don't do that, you may move their landmark because you teach them something that becomes a foundation, a focal point, a marker for them, on which they build other things, and they move their fence. Because you move their fence, they thought that was then their land, they start planting up a garden there. But they're planting that garden on someone else's land because of what you did. You can't do that. You got to be careful how we treat each other. And this goes to the last point of this week's Parashat. Well, there's two little points. One is not ready for war, right? It's about Torah study and emanations. And what I mean by that is we get a little part in this week's Parashat that talks about, if you haven't, you built your house but you haven't dedicated, don't go out to war and return. You're not ready to go to war. If you're afraid, don't go out. You'll hurt everybody else. You're not ready. You're going to hurt everybody else if you're not ready. That's exactly what Mashiach was saying when he says, get the beam out of your own eye. Right? If the blind lead the blind, they'll both fall into the pit. Why were you leading other people when you were still blind? Because you didn't think you were blind. So what is the sin? The sin was pride, that you didn't think you were blind. And just as the Pharisees say, are we blind? They don't believe they are. Because they don't have humility. Instead, they have pride. Those are opposites. So you need to learn how to walk out with pride and be fearful of yourself and your foolishness and what you're doing to others. It's a message a lot of people won't hear. They'll think, yeah, it's a good message for everybody else. Again, it's the same thing. Everything goes out from them that's bad towards everyone else is doing bad, but I'm doing right. It's an unjust judge. They don't have judgment in all their gates. They want to put judgment in your gates. You see? It's about the emanation. That if you don't get the beam out of your own eye, you are going to gouge other people's eye. You're going to be a harm to other people if you're trying to fix their eye. So this all goes back to Torah study. Not ready for war. You're not ready for war. Get your sin out. What happened with the children of Israel? They went around there and learned the Torah, right? In the wilderness. That's what they wandered before they were ready to go into war to fight the giants. They weren't prepared yet. We work on ourselves first, then other people. The last point here is about finding the dead body. And this is about the responsibility of ignorance. You see, none of those people killed that person. But they were still required to do something, which is to measure to the nearest city. Then those judges, the Levi'im, they were to come out and lop off the head of the heifer. Blood, which is teaching, is still required even if you are innocent. It isn't just about, who killed this person, I guess that they're just going to have to own up to it, and if they don't, well then we'll just all forget it. It isn't. That shows how we're tied to everybody. That you don't want that blood guiltiness, it says, in the land. You don't want that blood guiltiness upon your land. Even though you didn't do it, doesn't matter. You're connected and responsible for those people around you. There's a responsibility for ignorance. Even if you're ignorant, you have a responsibility to the Torah, which is why you don't want to be ignorant. Why you want to know. It would be much better if they knew who murdered this person so they could deliver him to the judges, and everything in the scales of the balance, or the scales of justice, would be balanced. Right? You found the person who did the crime, and they were punished. There we go. What happens when we don't know who? What happens, this goes back to what happens when we have no witnesses. As we were comparing this to Torah study, what happens when you don't know enough of the other Torah? That all you have is what you read right there, that sentence. You don't have the other witnesses in other parts of the scriptures to verify it or to contradict it. When you have no witnesses, you're in danger. There's blood guiltiness. There's responsibility. So you better hope that you have witnesses, and you better search for those witnesses, because you don't want to be in that situation where you have no witnesses. And when it comes to studying the Torah, you better hope that you have all those other witnesses. Right? Because there's going to be bloodshed and guilt for this sin. And you'll have to do something. Even though you can say, well, I was ignorant. That's not a good enough excuse. Sacrifices still had to be made because of the lack of witnesses. So this is what this week's message, this year's message, is about. Discerning between truth and lies. It's the watchman, it's the just judges in the gate, and you need to guard your own gates. Not just from the outside forces, but from the things that you let in, because ultimately you're responsible, even for your own ignorance. So continue to study, be fearful on the gate. Don't be quick to throw a spear at other people's ideas. Be quick to throw a spear at your own ideas. Until next time, I'm going to say Shalom.